start reading this until I get tired of it. Profession of Faith of a Savoyard Vicar. The Profession of Faith of a Savoyard Vicar by Janjak Rousseau. Expect from me neither learned declamations nor profound arguments. I am no great philosopher, and give myself but little trouble in regard to becoming such. Still I perceive sometimes the glimmering of good sense, and have always regard for the truth. I will not enter into any disputation or endeavor to refute you, but only lay down my own sentiments in simplicity of heart. Consult your own during this recital. This is all I require of you. If I am mistaken, it is undesignedly, which is sufficient to absolve me of all criminal error, and if I am right, reason, which is common to us both, shall decide. We are equally interested in listening to it, and why should not our views agree? I was born a poor peasant, destined by my situation to the business of husbandry. It was thought, however, much more advisable for me to learn to get my bread by the profession of a priest, and means were found to give me a proper education in this. Most certainly, neither my parents nor I consulted what was really good, true, or useful for me to know, but only that I should learn what was necessary to my ordination. I learned, therefore, what was required of me to learn. I said what was required of me to say, and accordingly was made a priest. It was not long, however, before I perceived too plainly that in laying myself under an obligation to be no longer a man, I had engaged for more than I could possibly perform. Some will tell us that conscience is founded merely on our prejudices, but I know from my own experience that its dictates constantly follow the order of nature, in contradiction to all human laws and institutions. We are in vain forbidden to do this thing or the other. We shall feel but little remorse for doing anything to which a well-regulated natural instinct excites us. Natural instinct excites us, however strongly soever prohibited by reason. Nature, my dear youth, hath hitherto in this respect been silent in you. May you continue long in that happy state wherein her voice is the voice of innocence. Remember that you offend her more by anticipating her instructions than by refusing to hear them. In order to know when to listen to her without a crime, you should begin by learning to check her insinuations. I had always a due respect for marriage as the first and most sacred institution of nature. Having given up my right to enter into such an engagement, I resolved, therefore, not to profane it, for notwithstanding my manner of education, as I had always led a simple and uniform life, I had preserved all that cleverness of understanding in which my first ideas were cultivated. The maxims of the world had not obscured my primitive notions, and my poverty kept me at a sufficient distance from those temptations that teach us the sophistry of vice. The virtuous resolution I had formed was, however, the very cause of my ruin, as my determination not to violate the rights of others left my faults exposed to detection. To expiate the offense, I was suspended and banished, fallen a sacrifice to my scruples rather than to my incontinence. From the reproaches made me on my disgrace, I found that the way to escape punishment for an offense is often by committing a greater. A few instances of this kind go far with persons capable of reflection, finding by sorrowful experience that the ideas I had formed of justice, honesty, and other moral obligations were contradicted in practice. I began to give up most of the opinions I had received, until at length, the few which I retained being no longer sufficient to support themselves, I called in question the evidence on which they were established. Thus, knowing hardly what to think, I found myself at last reduced to your own situation of mind, with this difference only, that my unbelief being the later fruit of a mature age, it was a work of greater difficulty to remove it. I was in that state of doubt and uncertainty in which Descartes requires the mind to be involved in order to enable it to investigate truth. This disposition of mind, however, is too disquieting to long continue, its duration being owing only to indolence or vice. My heart was not so corrupt as to seek fresh indulgence, and nothing preserves so well the habit of reflection as to be more content with ourselves than with our fortune. I reflected, therefore, on the happy lot of mortals floating always on the ocean of human opinions without compass or rudder, left to the mercy of their tempestuous passions, with no other guide than an inexperienced pilot, ignorant of his course as well as from whence he came and whither he is going. I often said to myself, I love the truth. I seek yet cannot find it. Let anyone show it to me, and I will readily embrace it. Why doth it hide its charms from a heart formed to adore them? I have frequently experienced at times much greater evils, and yet no part of my life was ever so constantly disagreeable to me as that interval of scruples and anxiety, running perpetually from one doubt and uncertainty to another. All that I could deduce from my long and painful meditations was incertitude, obscurity, and contradiction, as well with regard to my existence as to my duty. I cannot comprehend how any man can be sincerely a skeptic on principle. Such philosophers either do not exist or they are certainly the most miserable of men. To be in doubt about things which are important for us to know is a situation too perplexing for the human mind. It cannot long support such incertitude, but will, in spite of itself, determine one way or the other, rather deceiving itself than being content to believe nothing of the matter. What added further to my perplexity was that as the authority of the church in which I was educated was decisive and tolerated not the slightest doubt in rejecting one point, I thereby rejected in a manner all the others. The impossibility of admitting so many absurd decisions. Few doubt, two doubt over these more reasonable. In being told I must believe all, I was prevented from believing anything, and I knew not what course to pursue. In this situation, I consulted the philosophers. I turned over their books and examined their several opinions. I found them vain, dogmatical, and dictatorial, even in their pretended skepticism, ignorant of nothing, yet proving nothing, but ridiculing one another instead, and in this last particular only, in which they were all agreed they seemed to be in the right, affecting to triumph whenever they attacked their opponents. They lacked everything to make them capable of a vigorous defense. If you examine their reasons, you will find them calculated only to refute. If you number voices, everyone is reduced to his own suffrage. They agree in nothing but in disputing, and to attend to those was certainly not the way to remove my uncertainty. I conceived that the weakness of the human understanding was the first cause of the prodigious variety I found in their sentiments, and that pride was the second. We have no standard with which to measure this immense machine. We cannot calculate in its various relations. We neither know the first cause nor the final effects. We are ignorant even of ourselves. We neither know our own nature nor principle of action. Nay, we hardly know whether man be a simple or compound being. Impenetrable mysteries surround us on every side. They extend beyond the region of sense. We examine ourselves possessed of understanding to penetrate them, and we have only imagination. Everyone strikes out a way of his own across this imaginary world, but no one knows whether it will lead him to the point he aims at. We are yet desirous to penetrate, to know everything. The only thing we know not is to contentedly remain ignorant of what is impossible for us to know. We had much rather determine at random and believe the thing which is not than to confess that none of us is capable of seeing the thing that is, being ourselves but a small part of that great whole whose limits surpass our most extensive views, and concerning which its creator leaves us to make our idle conjectures. We are vain enough to decide what the whole is in itself and what we are in relation to it but were the philosophers in a situation to discover the truth, which of them would be interested in so doing? Each knows very well that his system is no better founded than the systems of others. He defends it nevertheless because it's his own. There is not one of them who really known the truth from falsehood would not prefer the latter if of his own invention to the former discovered by anyone else. Where is the philosopher who would not readily deceive mankind to increase his own reputation? Where is he who secretly proposes any other object than that of distinguishing himself from the rest of mankind, provided he raises himself above the vulgar and carries away the prize of fame from his competitors? What doth he require more? The most essential point is to think differently from the rest of the world. Among believers, he is an atheist, and among atheists, he affects to be a believer. The first fruit I gathered from these meditations was to learn to confine my inquiries to those in which I was immediately interested, to remain contented in a profound ignorance of the rest, and not to trouble myself so far as even to doubt about what it did not concern me to know. I could further to see that instead of clearing up any unnecessary doubts, the philosophers only contributed to multiply those which most tormented me, and that they resolved absolutely none. I therefore applied to another guide, and said to myself, let me consult my innate instructor, who will deceive me less than I may be deceived by others, or at least the errors I fall into will be my own, and I shall grow less depraved in the pursuit of my own illusions and in giving myself up to the deceptions of others. Taking a retrospect, then, of the several opinions which had successfully prevailed with me from my infancy, I found that although none of them were so evident as to produce immediate conviction, they had nevertheless different degrees of probability, and that my innate sense of truth and falsehood leaned more or less to each. On this first observation, proceeding to compare impartiality and without prejudice these different opinions with each other, I found that the first and most common was also the most simple and most rational, and that it wanted nothing more to secure universal suffrage than the circumstance of having been last proposed. Let us suppose that all our philosophers, ancient and modern, had exhausted all their whimsical systems of power, chance, fate, necessity, atoms, and animated world-sensitive matter, materialism, and of every other kind. And after them, let us imagine the celebrated Dr. Clarke enlightening the world by displaying the being of beings, the supreme and sovereign disposer of all things. With what universal admiration, with what unanimous applause would not the world receive this new system, so great, so consolatory, so sublime, so proper to elevate the soul, to lay the foundations of virtue, and at the same time so striking, so enlightened, so simple, and as it appears to me, pregnant with less incomprehensibilities and absurdities than all other systems whatever. I reflected that unanswerable objections might be made to all because the human understanding is incapable of resolving them. No proof, therefore, could be brought exclusively of any. But what difference is there in proofs? Not that system, then, which explains everything to be preferred when attended with no greater difficulties than the rest. The love of truth, then, comprises all my philosophy, and my method of research being the simple and easy rule of common sense, which dispenses with the vain subtlety of argumentation. I re-examined by this principle all the knowledge of which I was possessed, resolved to admit as evident everything to which I could not in the sincerity of my heart refuse to assent, to admit also as true all that seemed to have a necessary connection with it, and to leave everything else as uncertain without either rejecting or admitting, being determined not to trouble myself about clearing up any point which did not tend to utility in practice. But after all, who am I? Who am I? What right have I to judge of these things? And what is it that determines my conclusions? If, subject to the impressions I receive, these are formed in direct consequence of those impressions, I trouble myself to propose to no purpose in these investigations. It is necessary, therefore, to examine myself to know what instruments are made use of in such researches and how far I may confide in their use. In the first place, I know that I exist and have senses whereby I am affected. This is a truth so striking that I am compelled to acquiesce in it. But I have properly a distinct sense of my existence, or do I only know it from my various sensations? This is my first doubt, which at present it is impossible for me to resolve, for being continually affected by my sensations, either directly from the objects or from the memory, how can I tell whether my self-consciousness be or be not something foreign to those sensations and independent of them? My sensations are internal. My sensations are all internal, as they make me sensible of my own existence, but the cause of them is external and independent, as they affect me without my consent and do not depend on my will for their production or annihilation. I can see very clearly, therefore, that the sensation which is internal and its cause or object which is external are not one and the same thing. Thus I know that I not only exist, but that other beings exist as well as myself. To wit, the objects of my sensations, and though these objects should be nothing but ideas, it is very certain that these ideas are no part of myself. Now, everything that I perceive out of myself and which acts upon my senses I call matter, and those portions of matter which I conceive are united in individual things I call bodies. Thus, all the disputes between idealists and materialists signify nothing to me. There are distinctions between the appearance and reality of bodies being chimerical. Being just chimerical. Just fucking chimerical. Lay my in on that. Hence I acquired as a certain knowledge existence in my universe. What the fuck is chimerical? Chimerical. Of a mythic animal formed from parts of various animals, hoped for but illusory or impossible to achieve. The notion of tolerance is but a chimeric dream. So, there are distinctions between the appearance and reality of bodies being chimerical. Idealist, materialist, shut the fuck up. Okay, appearance, reality, bodies, it's all chimerical. Just a bunch of chimericality. Just a bunch of chimericality. Chimericality. Just a bunch of chimericality. 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 Look at all this chimericality. I'm sick of all the chimericality. The characteristic faculty of an intelligent active being is, in my opinion, that of giving a sense to the world.